Hey, what's up everybody? Today we're going to rock these 3 pendants. Let's do it. Alright, in this video we're making 3 different pendants. I started out the first one with just basically a homemade jig, more of a jam chuck I guess you'd say. Just kind of using the actual one-way chuck that I had installed in the headstock. The other 2 I start off with aftermarket jigs that you can just buy. And they're off-center jig. One is the Niles jig and one is the Axminster jig. So we'll go through a little bit of that. I don't really go through actual setups of the jig because there's plenty of videos on those and that's not really what this is meant for. This video is more so just to see a few different ways that you could turn pendants. In this first pendant, I start out in the one-way chuck like I mentioned earlier, and I already had a piece that was round. It's a cutoff from something else that I'd worked on previously, and I basically just shape the front of the pendant, and then you'll see me part it off here in a second. Once I get the front pendant to pretty much the desired shape, I sand. So I just sand, on this one I believe I only sanded by hand, a little bit with the lathe on, a little bit with the lathe off, starting at 120 and then I went up to 400. Okay, what you see me doing here is moving the piece forward in the jaws before I part it off. This is a one-way chuck with serrated jaws, so they leave indentations in the piece, which for something like this is a great help because I was just able to move the piece forward and still grab into those jaw marks that were a little farther back, so it kept everything nice and true and was really simple to part off. Here I'm measuring the outside diameter of the pendant that we just turned. I'm then going to transfer those markings over to the piece left and I'm going to use that as my jam chuck. Following the markings we made, I turn down the center of what becomes the jam chuck. You also see that I turn out a hole completely through the center of the chuck. The reason for that is so that we can push the pendant out later. We are going to add hot glue here in a second, and it just makes it a little bit easier to get out of there. Okay, once we've got the center of our jam chuck turned down, we just size up the pendant, make sure we measured correctly, and then next we're going to add a few dabs of hot glue. I added more than you probably need. You can probably get away with maybe just 1 on each side. You don't need too much. You don't want to do too much overall because then it's harder to get out of there. Next, we'll introduce our first aftermarket jig. This is the Axminster jig. So once I get everything all glued up in the jam chuck, I take it back out of the one-way chuck, and then I will double-sided tape it onto the Axminster jig. You'll see me set it up back in the chuck after that, and we're going to use that to offset turn our first part, which will actually be our through hole that we put our cord in. Okay, once we get the through hole taken care of, we're going to add a couple more embellishments. I'm going to make a mark around that first through hole and then eventually a second mark around that one. And since we are turning off center and the center of the pendant is, I guess, convex, you could say, it's protruding out farther than the outside diameter, we're only going to end up turning through part of the pendant. So this will basically create a couple smiley faces, if you will, and it's a nice little effect to add on. Once we're done making those two embellishments, I do a little bit of sanding still on the lathe and then eventually pop the pendant off the lathe and out of the jam chuck, sanding the back and the sides and calling this one done, moving on to the next one. Okay, this next one I start out with in between centers. It's already round, so that's helpful once again. It is quite a bit oversized though. So I put it between centers, turn it down to a closer size before we add it to the Axminster chuck. Now that we got the piece a little closer to the size we're looking for, I add it to the Axminster chuck and bring the tailstock up. Here, I'll true everything up to our final dimensions and shape the front and the sides of the pendant. Here we again sand from 120 to 400, and after that we'll make an adjustment with the chuck to turn it off center and make our markings for our through hole for our cord. On this piece I did something a little different than with our first pendant. I actually put a small diameter drill bit in the drill chuck and put it through. Since we were working with a little bit of a thicker piece of stock, I wasn't completely convinced that I had turned deep enough to get through that piece for our cord. So I figured just drilling through there, that would definitely guarantee I had what we needed. After drilling out our through hole, I then marked the piece for a couple more embellishments. I used an Easywood Tools detailer and a Robert Sorby beading tool to add a nice little ring around it and a couple other small things. After that, we parted off. Once parted off, I turned the pendant around and added to the headstock with a little bit of double-sided tape attached to the Axminster jig. I hold it in place with the tailstock with a rubber chucky extension that I have on there. I love this thing. I just got it, and honestly, all the products I use from them are really awesome. That's all I've ever heard anybody else say about them as well. They're also a great company to deal with on a more personal level, so I highly recommend you check them out. I keep that in place for as long as possible, and then once I'm down to that centerpiece, you'll see me pull it back and finish the piece off with only the tape holding it on. When we have our desired shape, we just finish off with sanding once again, 120 to 400, a little bit on the back, take it off of the chuck, add a little bit of sanding around the sides, and we're good to go on to our third piece. All right, here goes our third piece. You'll see with this piece, I started right on the chuck with some double-sided tape. This is the Niles jig, and it works pretty similar to the Axminster jig. It has a couple different features though. Again, I'm not trying to go too far in depth into what each jig does. You guys can kind of check those out in other videos. But I do, again, start right on the jig with the double-sided tape, turn down the front, shape up the sides, and then kind of start marking it and making the adjustments on the jig to go off center. Okay, once we have everything sized up and our hole for our cord turned through, I take the jig and again make an adjustment to do some further embellishments. On this one, I wanted to do a couple things that went through what we had already turned, so I just made the appropriate adjustments on the jig that would make those marks. Okay, I wanted to show you something pretty cool here. You are turning quite a bit of air, so what I did is I took one of these shots and I slowed it down as much as I could to really show you how much air you're turning. You just keep a steady hand, keep the tool in place, and it will do what it needs to do for you. Okay, once we were done with our embellishments on the front, I parted it off, turned it around, again attaching it with some double-sided tape and the tailstock with the rubber chucky extension, and shaped our back, sanded it, did a little power sanding on this one just to show you a little bit of difference. All right, here we are with all three pendants turned down and ready for finish. This is a great view because you can see the differences that we did for each one. Nothing crazy. You could go absolutely nuts with the embellishments that you do. I'm pretty sure there's even things online that give you measurements for each jig and things like that. I honestly don't get that crazy. I just try to have a lot of fun with them. Our finish for choice here is going to be walnut oil. Really simple but powerful finish. I love using this stuff. You just pour some on, rub it in with your hands or with a light cloth, let it dry for a bit, and then wipe off any excess, and you're good to go.